Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and you were just reading from Exodus 33 and 34. All those mentions of the face of God and the face of Moses and veils and stuff. Well, here's the second part, the second half of what Aarvoll wrote to me as a reply to the video that I made about him and Jay Dyer. Anyway, he writes, quote, and by the way, I think he actually gets it. He gets me. He understood the question, that's amazing in itself, okay? And I think some of what he says here is it's a great place to start. So listen, he says, quote, "Really, it seems like you're concerned about the value of intuition and analogical thought in a thoroughly rational world. In my own view, the laws of logic are more fundamental and simpler than the laws of physics, and the laws of physics are more fundamental and simpler than the complex dynamics of interaction between biological organisms. If you were going to create a logical map of the behavior of a human being, it would be impossibly vast. So we didn't evolve to analyze everyday things logically. It would be too expensive to calculate. We developed simplifying heuristics instead. Similar to how I love this, because watch him use an analogy. Similar to how video rendering finds ways of eliminating information from its signal which is unnecessary for the communication of meaning to our sense faculties, and amplifying signals which are critical for the bandwidth of human attention." And what a perfect analogy, right? Now I understand. I get it. He continues, "Intuition simplifies and aggregates large numbers of what would otherwise be more rigorous logical judgments. More complex phenomena can't be thoroughly logically analyzed, so we have to simplify and approximate." And then he says something about Carl Jung's Myers-Briggs basis, he says, intuition, in Jung's sense, is an apprehension of potentials rather than actuals, which is sensing. And complex judgments of probability spaces do have to be simplified and felt out in ways that don't reduce to simple deterministic logic maps. I think I follow. But then he says, "Such simplifying heuristics can be considered to validly apply to large sets of specific, more fundamental logical relations, hence their inherently intuitive nature." And then he says he's an intuitive type as well, which is interesting. Because I think he's like a master of the analytic mind, which maybe isn't necessarily opposite in the same way that sensing is the opposite of intuition, but maybe I'll come back to that. So anyway, he says the twist in this, which gives greater value to such heuristics, is the idea that our consciousness is always already heuristic and can be applied with equal validity to a broad set of underlying, most specific logical structures. In such a case, our intuitive leaps and analogical vision can actually have a direct influence on the nature of the more fundamental logical substructures in which our consciousness inheres. So it's not a matter of simple bottom-up emergence into higher-level, more intuitive thoughts. The higher and more intuitive can likewise determine the lower and more strictly logical in my own conception. Okay, thank you for the comment, Aarvoll. Thanks for watching and listening and stuff. I'm still thinking about this, and again, to be honest, I'm a guy who spent a lot more time reading stuff like the Iliad and novels, and so it is a different thing. It's very challenging for me to read and to listen to him, but not because he does it badly. I just think, again, like I said in the last video, it's sort of in another register. All right, continuing. This is me now. There's a book I glanced at for a few minutes many years ago. The book is called Wittgenstein on Aesthetic Understanding. And in that book, there's a chapter that I thumbed through by a guy named Bernard Rhie, R-H-I-E, titled The Philosophy of the Face. I remembered the title, so the other day I found this guy's dissertation. Listen to the first 5 sentences of it. He says, quote, "This dissertation explores the importance of the human face in modern literature, philosophy, and art. Meaning is a physiognomy," wrote Wittgenstein. quite literally, if somewhat cryptically, in the philosophical investigations. My project takes this remark seriously and begins in chapters 1 and 2 by reading Wittgenstein's discussion of aspect seeing alongside recent work in cognitive science and the philosophy of mind in order to explain how we perceive mentality in the appearance of a human face. End quote from the dissertation. So 15 years ago, when I was thumbing through that book, it all sort of perplexed me. And now, 15 years later, I think it kind of repulses me, but I say that hesitantly. Because even as it repulses me, I wonder if it's right and proper. We learned from the Stoics and from Plotinus that enlightenment or philosophy requires giving up attachment. And one of those attachments is comfort. And so it comforts me to not analyze faces, at least not to do it consciously and philosophically. And so a corollary to my question about whether it's right and good to do this kind of analysis springs to mind. In high school, I was repulsed by the required dissections of a cow's eye, a frog, a fetal pig. But I was told that this is the way. This is right and proper. Science, And now let's all look again at the famous 1632 painting by Rembrandt titled The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolas Tulp. There it is. The entire philosophical enlightenment at its very start, 1632, very early, shown in one painting. And actually, I prefer Rembrandt's less famous version on the same theme, if you will. Take a look now at The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Diejman. This one's from 1656. Okay, now before I continue, I want to be clear about what I'm doing here. I'm posing a question, chiefly to myself. Okay? In Parmenides' poem on nature, which is like pretty much required reading for this channel, I don't think I've really done the deep dive on it yet, but I say it's required reading because it's so short. It's fragmentary, we've lost chunks of it, and it's the only Parmenides writing that survives. So the poem is called On Nature, and in it he suggests right at the outset that there are two ways or paths through life. The way of persuasion, which most take, and the way of truth. You guys get the distinction, I think, after watching my video on sophistry and the Gorgias, right? This entire channel, and to the extent that I can hold the line, my entire life is, at least aspirationally, sort of an effort to walk the way of truth. But whether the way of truth involves cutting up the faces of the dead in order to better understand how physiognomy works, in order to compose treatises on the philosophy of the face, this is all an open question to me. And I mean it. I'm not necessarily against such investigations, though I'm not inclined to them. And I'm trying to decide whether these sorts of disenchanting undertakings can improve me or the world in some way. In a recent episode on Euripides' play, The Bacchae, I was moved to consider the old question of Apollonianism and Dionysianism, and to think about which side I might take. The truth is, I don't like taking sides, and I have a strong anchor in something like Taoism or Bakhtinian dialogism, which means I really sort of believe that both of these modes, these registers, Apollonian and Dionysian, serve a purpose and are both appropriate depending on context and timing. But one of the questions that came up in that episode, because it's right there on the surface in the play, is whether or not dancing needs a philosophical defense. Think about what that question is. It is to seek an Apollonian defense of a Dionysian activity. How fascinating. We could reverse it just as easily and ask, for example, whether the DMV, or the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, the department, is exciting and liberating enough, and whether it provokes enough of an emotional response, and whether it serves enough wine. In other words, it's an odd sort of measurement, right? To revert to sort of measure by the opposite standard there. And then there was the seriously impromptu and spontaneous video reply that I posted to Aarvoll. And by the way, I love how I can spend 10 hours making a video with careful editing on Euripides, full of content, making learning fun. And that video gets half as many views as one I do when, I just rattle off some half-cocked reflexive thought after watching 2/3 of one of Aarvoll's videos. That reflects poorly on some of you. But anyway, in that video reply, I basically tried to ask whether there might be a Dionysian mode of thinking that is sort of divergent from the Apollonian mode, where the Apollonian mode is abstract and categorical and philosophical and analytical, and where the Dionysian involves, dancing. And how do we bridge these two modes? And what, from the analytical mode, am I required to understand? And okay, why am I asking that? Frankly, am I just lazy, looking for a shortcut? Because Aarvoll seems earnest and very smart to me, but I still have a hard time understanding him because he has acquired a lot of terminology that's not natural to me. And so I'm trying to wade through that to kind of find the thing itself underneath all that. Am I just, trying to avoid doing my homework by demanding that he, give it to me as a parable or something? That's the question here. That's a good question, I think. Am I just being queasy about cutting into the cow's eyeball again? Which would be, cowardly by one sort of explanation. Or is there another way to learn, at least the important part, of what I would learn by cutting into the cow's eye? And so I ask again about dance. And I ask about, what we consciously and subconsciously register when we look, for example, at a human face. And there are multiple questions here. Should we subject dancing and faces to analysis? And is it necessary that we do so? But there are other Dionysian rituals we might consider. I'm told that it's possible to understand music or explain music by learning to read the music sheets and by doing technical analysis and ultimately even by math. My friend Philip Daniel seems to understand music, but the question is, does he enjoy it more than I do because he understands it? I want to keep reiterating this. I'm not defending a thesis here. I'm asking questions and ultimately posing those questions to myself. But of course, I'm inviting participation. You guys all did a great job with the comments on the Aarvoll video. That actually helps me. I know that it's, I think that it's pretty rare. If I have a virtue, this may be my virtue. Although it's strange because to me, it's also uncomfortable. To me, it's challenging. To me, it's difficult. I get worn out thinking like this. Sometimes I wish that my brain wasn't structured to just keep asking questions, but so it goes. And maybe it's a kind of virtue because it really does invite participation. Help me think through this idea. I'm asking questions and ultimately, like I said, posing them to myself. But it does seem more plausible to argue that maybe, yes, indeed, the one who knows more about music can enjoy it more. Okay, fine, maybe. But that argument needs to be made clearer for me. Okay? Now, that is a steep demand. It's kind of like saying, right now I'm ignorant. Someone needs to teach me or else I reject their views, right? And so it's that's not fair. You should have to do the work. Go read about music and then try listening to it again and see if it's better for you, right? Maybe. Okay, what psychological concerns motivate my inquiry here? Well, first, I want to escape death. That's my first motivation, right? I want to live forever. I want to be saved. And so I'm looking for loopholes in all of this material. Right, but okay, that's a big ask. But beyond that, maybe I also want to like navigate life effectively to the extent that that's possible and allowable within a saved framework. That is to say, like, I could become a pirate probably, maybe. I mean, and make my way through life, but like that also feels kind of wrong. And so what we're looking for is a way through life that's not incorrect, not wrong, not bad, and that's also, that flourishes, okay? Okay, so I'm looking for that. And maybe that implies that I want to acquire a certain kind of power, either social or political, etc. And maybe these concerns obscure my thinking or send my inquiry in wrong or unfruitful directions. All of this is definitely possible. And it's what I'm keeping all this in mind, or trying to, like, as I ask these questions. Now, on top of these hesitations, I have my own personal, subjective experience to grapple with. Experience that I rarely hear addressed when I read philosophy. So, while some philosophy seems not untrue, I never give it my full emotional assent until it makes me feel seen, until it suggests a place for me or a path for me. There certainly is a place for political philosophy. Really, nobody debates that nowadays. A philosophy of social order. Man is definitely a social and political animal. But I'm also a single, sentient being. And at least in some cases, the claims made on me by my own experience seem to trump any claims made by the polity and its philosophers. From this perspective, which may well indeed be reasonably criticized by a social philosopher as selfish or whatever, but it is from this perspective, while thinking about my experience as an individual, that I become a philosopher of particulars, of sensation, of metaphor, of meaning. My interests shift from talking about things like egalitarianism and modernism and fascism and nationalism to talking about why colors seem to have a tone and whether early Jackson Pollock was actually good. And it's from this perspective that I go on to consider the seasonal and yearly patterns of growth in the rhododendron and dogwood in my backyard. And I consider how the roots of trees work. And I speculate about how they interact with the mycelia of underground mushrooms. And that sends me thinking about the impossibility of definitions, because differentiation gets blurry as you approach this state. Because we are becoming sensation now, and we no longer study the rhizome or the iris, but we were wondering whether the rhizome itself, or the plant, or that ephemeral flower, or its stigmatic lip. Yes, we were wondering which of that is the essential iris, because we are actually now become the iris, and although we see that, yes, okay, the general well-being of the iris species, or even our particular cultivar, matter somewhat in an abstract way, in spite of all that. And yes, we have to concede that to some flower Hobbes. But in spite of all that, the main thing is, holy shit, can you believe we are dirt become conscious and made into this beautiful shape, and that we last only a day? And then one of my neighboring iris flowers leans over and whispers to me, "But a day," like a poet, from over there in the shade. Okay, are we ready to continue? Come back down to the Apollonian realm. Leave that Dionysian madness, that lyricism. Let's be clear and direct now. Okay, you're saying, Casey, give us a controversial thesis now, so that someone can argue with you about it on YouTube, you know? I mean, I did want to sort of analyze the concept of parables in a very organized and sober fashion. That's very manly, you know. But as honorable a pursuit as analyzing the concept of parable as a linguistic form seems, actually making parables is a very different thing, right? We could discuss something like how Homer's use of simile creates repeating missed beats in the cycle of dactylic hexameter. Wouldn't that be interesting? And perhaps we would be delighted by that. But it would be a very specific sort of claim to argue that understanding such a concept is like crucial for salvation, you know? The way we are kind of maybe potentially arguing here that analytical philosophical prose and terminology, with all its regularity and incisiveness and so on, might be necessary. Like to understand Plato might be so necessary that it's worth the effort, okay? But even if that's the case, doing the analysis of Homer's poetry is very different, I think, than just reading stuff like this. Now the two Iantes and Odysseus and Diomedes stirred the Danaans to fight, since themselves they did not fear the force of the men of Troy, nor their charges onward, but stayed where they were. Listen, here's the analogy. They stayed where they were, Odysseus and Diomedes, stayed where they were, not rushing into battle, like clouds, which the son of Cronos stops in the windless weather on the heights of the towering mountains, motionless, when the strength of the north wind sleeps, and the other tearing winds, those winds that when they blow into tempests, high screaming, descend upon the darkening clouds and scatter them. So the Danaans stood ready against the Trojans, nor gave way. Now, I don't know about you, but that is a lot different than some analysis that would appear in, von Clausewitz about, or whatever, about how the troops were stationary until the moment was right. Do you understand? Like, to add this layer of metaphor, for me, all of a sudden it's crystal clear. And I see what an interesting tactic it is and like why it mattered. Not just reading these lines, you understand, but reading them again for the third time after reading the entire narrative and knowing exactly what scene these lines come from, remembering that scene as we remember days from our own life. That's the kind of reading I'm talking about here. This is a sensuous rather than a theoretical thing. It's experiential rather than an idea, right? And by the way, it's worth saying, as we experiment with this sort of talk, that this is very much a sort of moral challenge for me. It's sort of embarrassing, right? In this circle, at least, to talk like this. It's too experimental, or it's too soft, or receptive, or girlish, or, it's hippie-ish to talk like this, something like that. But before you make that judgment, just perceive what we're achieving in this sort of rhetoric. It's actually a thing on a different axis. We have room to breathe a little with this sort of rhetoric. The point is, when I look at the world, I do see the problems with what we have called globalism, for example. I don't want us to all be melded together into an international man who lives and works and dies. So that's worth worrying about. That's worth talking about. It's worth understanding. And that's the axis where it's like somebody says, hey, there are, rainbow flags all over the church. And we need to be fascists like King Pentheus to try to legally abolish certain troubling behaviors. Okay. Like, I see that. That's a valid concern. But let me suggest here another concern. It's on a different axis, you understand? But we're being blinded to it, I think, by our concern for this other stuff. Here's just one other concern. There is a huge crackdown happening on freedom of speech. We've been told to stay 6 feet away from people who aren't in our family, to cover our faces. We have to check emails every day, or we get in trouble with our bosses. We have to get our cars inspected. We have to get the vaccine. We have to eat less meat. We have to educate our children in that peculiar way. We have to not grow tomatoes in the front yard because the HOA says so. File our taxes by April 1st. And so on. In all these ways, and in 1,000 other ways, we are legislated near to death already. We need to carve out some Dionysian space now, organize skinny dipping rituals, figure out ways to alter our consciousness together, preferably by vigorous outdoor exertion like wrestling or dancing. This kind of thing. You guys get it. And you might say, well, look, I mean, we're for law and order, but we meant it theoretically, And you might go on to say, like, we concede, Casey, like, this current regime is a nightmarish dictatorship. But if we were in charge, we would control the sexual sin and build beautiful churches and make women braid their blonde hair in the wheat field and so on. Okay, again, great. That's worth thinking about, and it's fun to talk about. I love conversation. I'm fascinated by that stuff. But remember, you're not in charge right now of all that, right? None of us are. We're the persecuted minority now, right? What you are in danger of beyond that, and what you might have some control over if you argue it the right way, is that you're losing anything, like any aspect of your life that can be considered freedom, right? It's happening to all of us. Freedom in this circle, because of your concerns about the women in the wheat fields and the church building and all that stuff, has become, and the sexual sin, has become almost like a taboo word. It's like something to make fun of, like, oh, those libertarians, how silly. But meanwhile, like, honestly, it is the crackdown from legalist governors all over the world that threatens me a lot more, frankly, than, like, rainbow flags. I mean, I don't approve of them, but I just don't do that stuff, and my kids won't either, because I'm going to teach them not to. It's pretty easy, actually, to teach them that. It's a lot harder to, like, if you can't go into a grocery store without a mask on, for example, that sets up some real problems we might want to. And so I'm saying, break out that yellow "Don't tread on me" flag again. Like, don't throw it away yet. Okay? I have this one memory of my, crazy uncle. I hope you all have one. From when I was about 10 years old. We used to meet up with his family once a year, hang with the cousins, at this sort of minor getaway resort thing in northern Michigan. My parents were both sober people, never drank anything. But this uncle and his wife loved wine. One night on this vacation when I was like 10 years old, he made us all go out to the beach just at sunset. And as the sun was going down, and even after that, he was building a pile of driftwood from way up on the shore to make a bonfire. And as soon as it was dark, he lit it up, big. And we all stood around it. And then he stepped away. And the next thing I knew, I looked over and he was naked and sprinting into the lake, howling, "It's cold! It's so cold!" And my mom, I love her, a beautiful woman, Apollonian, was going, "Oh, geez, your uncle is such a nut." And I remember the blackness of the water under the black sky, where everything outside of the glow of the fire seemed swallowed by this darkness and uncertainty. And my uncle swam out deep, probably 50 yards beyond where we could see him, into that dark. And his voice just came echoing back to us. And he was shouting between gulps of water. It's fresh water, right? Lake Michigan. "Who's coming out?" And my mom leaned over and whispered again to me, "He's so crazy." And in retrospect, and I think even at the time, I realized she wanted to protect me from that energy. You see what I mean? The Apollonian doesn't like that level of disorder. They're kind of afraid of it. And like they don't want to give their children over to it. And I understand the danger, right? I do get it. I don't live like my uncle, the crazy uncle. I don't even drink alcohol, right? But he did go out there into the dark. And he's not crazy to this day. In fact, I think he's Dionysus, you know? Now here's the thing, like, this story, which is a real memory for me, is it a parable? Like, is it a parable? And honestly, I can't even tell. Like, is it possible that certain memories become memories, that we remember them? Because, like, they fit the structure. You know what I mean by that? Like, they were true reflections of, like, experience, of psychology, of what it feels like, you know? And maybe that's why the brain decides to store them, right, or to remember them. And it's interesting that that happens so, like, subconsciously, right? You don't really always decide what things you'll remember. I mean, I have these images that I remember of, you know, the classroom in second grade or whatever, but it's just, it seems random, right? I've also been looking at a book of the essential writings of Zen Master Dogen. I'm thinking about doing an episode, but I don't know. I'm not promising that one. But listen to what he says on one of these little paragraph pages. Quote, "There are mountains hidden in treasures. There are mountains hidden in swamps. There are mountains hidden in the sky. There are mountains hidden in mountains. There are mountains hidden in hiddenness. This is how we study. An ancient Buddha said, 'Mountains are mountains, waters are waters.' These words do not mean mountains are mountains. They mean mountains are mountains." Ooh, yeah. Well, this other way of thinking, I mean, this lyrical, anti-rational, non-rational way of thinking, where does it get us? I mean, it's absolutely true that there is great value in Plato. I love reading Plato. I really do. I'm going to do the Parmenides dialogue soon. But it would be wrong to say that rationalism is the only tradition native to us. This lyrical and metaphorical register is very much found in the West, and not just in Buddhism, right? Not as an import. In fact, it came before the philosophers in Hesiod and Homer, and in the mystery rites of, Eleusis. And it was right there with Plato in Zeno's own, koans. That's the Zen word for it, but I don't know what Zeno called them. Paradoxes, right? But what is being taught in these riddles, in these always referential ways of thinking? What do I mean by that? Well, Zeno's parables are always about, things in the world, right? They're always parables. They're always analogies, a turtle and a hare or whatever. I still struggle to pin it down, though. Like, what is being taught in these riddles? It's hard to name, for me at least. I've asked whether learning Plato can improve me morally. Does understanding his tripartite soul stuff make me less likely to cheat on my wife, or less likely to be gluttonous or greedy or vengeful or whatever? But I should put a similar question to the rhetoric of parables and lyricism. These divergent modes both seem valuable to me. That is the rational and the lyrical, or whatever we call them. I listened to this interesting video of a friend of the show, Kenneth Brown, recently, and he was talking about how bodies are like clothes. Ultimately, the body is not us, right? I think, and like this is just sort of a strong dualism. I mean, I think most of us think like this. I think he said that at best, our bodies are sort of like a representation or a projection of us, an avatar or something like that. But I mean, that's still super interesting to me. It makes the face even into a kind of metaphor or like an analogy. For what, though, right? How interesting is that? Like, if I am not my face then becomes only the visible imprint of an invisible thing itself. And that's me. And that means this isn't me at some level. Like that's very strange, right? And like, I think most people I mean, I don't know, I don't think Kenneth said this, but like, I think most people do imagine that somehow the face, it's not like totally unrelated to the thing itself, the soul, or whatever, right? That like somehow this face like reflects the shape of my soul or something, but my soul doesn't really have a shape. So what do we mean by this, right? This is how mind-blowing to me analogical thinking can be. And what I'm not clear about is whether it teaches different things than, the Platonic, analytical, philosophical thought, or whether like thinking in terms of analogies can teach all of that same stuff, more or less. I just don't know. I'm not sure yet. The other day I was walking in my neighborhood, and for a moment I became very hyper-conscious, like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, of the way that eye contact is a very carefully orchestrated thing. It depends on whether I am walking alone or with my wife, whether I'm running, whether I'm listening to music or whatever, right? All of this determines how I say hi, or whether I just wave or nod, and how long I hold eye contact, and whether I make the eye contact first and hold it longer. And that depends on whether it's a woman or a man, and perhaps even what their social status appears to be. And it happens like that, right? But then to imagine on top of all that all of it is only like a delicate interplay, not of selves, but of analogies. Because your face is an analogy, my face is an analogy, we're doing the eye contact thing. And then you have to figure in this right now, how does this change it? Where I'm looking at you, or it appears to be true, and you're looking at me, but like, we can't see each other. I'm looking at a camera right now. I guess you can see my face, but it's smushed, it's two-dimensional, and it doesn't matter because it's just an analogy anyway. This is all mind-blowing to me, and I love it. I love it. I love thinking about it. It's all very fascinating, of course, but like, as I was walking and thinking about all this stuff, there came a moment where I realized, only too late, that I had walked right past another person, like without even acknowledging them, because I was in my head so much, staring at the ground or off into space or whatever. Like, the thinking about nodding made me forget to actually nod. Isn't that interesting? The analysis of nodding paralyzed the nodding, which suggests maybe we can't be in both of these modes or registers at the same time. I do think you can move back and forth between, judging and perceiving, or between Apollo and Dionysus or whatever, right? Or between nodding and thinking about nodding, being sociable and thinking about being sociable, right? Like smiling and writing an essay on the philosophy of smiling. Okay, I think you can move back and forth. But I do think it's very difficult to do both of them at the same time. And part of what I'm interested in here and asking about here is, do cameras and does the medium of YouTube restrict us to only Apollonian thinking? Is it possible to do Dionysian thinking on a camera? Like, think of like something like a drum circle or whatever. You could maybe try to organize that in a Zoom call, but wouldn't it be, I don't know, like I have a hard time imagining that you're going to conjure the same furies and, energy that you would if you do it in the heart of downtown Asheville, together, where like eye contact and smiles can be exchanged and so on. And so this is worth acknowledging if we realize that like spending time on YouTube, if it's always only Apollonian and it's always only like rationalist and analytical and stuff, and like we're not getting in our time, our necessary, like God commanded time. That's what I said in the last episode on the Bacchae, where we dance and we sing. And I mean, this is why like all the churches have been closed, and they'll do it on TV, right? They'll show you. I mean, my church hasn't opened in a year and a half. We can watch it and like watch some, the choir director sings her song. And once in a while, they'll have a choir record some stuff and put it there. But that's not the same thing, is it? So like I'm saying, in these closed down churches, there is an element that's being sucked out. And that element would seem to be the Holy Spirit, the Dionysian, the felt lived experience element. And the same goes for our conversations, where it's like if I had had this conversation with Aarvoll around a campfire, I know for sure that I would be high-fiving him by now, because I wouldn't have to talk so much. You know what I mean? Like, and I would be like, yes, because there's that thing that happens where the idea is being exchanged. That's how I learn best, is in dialogue. But like we are in such a sort of marginal position politically, rhetorically, that I don't know very many people in real life who would be able to follow this video and kind of like understand my terminology and be interested in it and share my perspectives and all that stuff. And so I want the dialogue. I want us to have our Dionysian moments together, but then I realized like it basically doesn't happen. Although it was cool that Kenneth made the road trip last week. Anyway, here's my last analogy, and I'll give it to you as an analogy rather than as analysis. It is like that science experiment where the light particle must pass through the gold sheet opening either as a waveform or as a particle, but it can't be both. And I am that thing passing through the gold sheet, right? I am that thing, either one or the other. And what determines how this particle or wave goes through the opening? In that experiment, isn't it the observer somehow? And so is there an observer in all this? The fates maybe, or my maker? Child of God, guys, but relax. It's only a metaphor.